The black Mercedes pulled up in front of Azure, one of those fancy restaurants where a single appetizer costs more than most people spend on groceries in a week. The kind of place with crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths so crisp they look like they've never been used before. A man stepped out, tall and confident, wearing a suit that probably cost more than a used car. This was Richard Chen, though most people just knew him as the tech guy who turned a simple app idea into a billion-dollar empire. Richard wasn't born into money. Far from it, actually. He grew up in a tiny apartment where the heat didn't always work in winter, and his mom worked herself to the bone just to keep food on the table. She cleaned houses during the day and waited tables at night. Coming home so exhausted she'd fall asleep in her work uniform. Richard never forgot those days, no matter how many zeros got added to his bank account. Tonight was supposed to be important. He had 3 investors flying in from different parts of the country, each one worth hundreds of millions. They wanted to partner with him on his next big venture, and everyone assumed it was a done deal. After all, Richard had the golden touch. Everything he invested in seemed to turn into money. But Richard had a secret that none of these investors knew about. He didn't just care about profits and quarterly returns. He cared about something most rich people seemed to forget: character. See, Richard had learned a long time ago that you can have all the business degrees and financial expertise in the world, but if you don't have basic human decency, you're not someone worth doing business with. As he walked into Azure, the maitre d' practically tripped over himself greeting Richard. "Mr. Chen, wonderful to see you again. Your private dining room is ready, sir. We've prepared everything exactly as you requested." Richard nodded and followed him through the main dining area. The restaurant was busy tonight, filled with well-dressed people having quiet conversations over expensive wine. Classical music played softly in the background. Everything looked perfect, exactly the kind of place where million-dollar deals got made. But Richard wasn't looking at the fancy decor or the impressive wine list. He was watching the staff. Specifically, he was watching a young waitress moving between tables with practiced efficiency. She looked to be in her mid-20s with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, and eyes that carried that particular kind of tiredness that comes from working double shifts and worrying about bills. Her name tag said, Riley. Richard watched as she approached. A table of college kids who were clearly on a tight budget, probably celebrating something special. Most waitresses at a place like this would have written them off, focused their energy on the tables that could afford to leave big tips. But Riley treated them like they were the most important customers in the restaurant. She smiled genuinely, made recommendations that were actually affordable, and when one of them asked about the cheapest wine on the menu, she didn't make them feel bad about it. At the next table, an elderly couple was having trouble reading the menu in the dim lighting. Without being asked, Riley pulled out her phone's flashlight and held it over their menu, chatting with them warmly while they made their selections. She wasn't doing it for show. There was no manager watching, no one to impress. She was just being kind because that's who she was. Richard noticed something else too. Riley's shoes were worn down at the heels, the kind of worn that comes from standing for hours every single day. Her uniform was clean and pressed, but he could see it had been mended in a few places. Despite working in a restaurant that probably paid her barely above minimum wage, she carried herself with dignity. There was something familiar about her, something that reminded him painfully of his own mother. The maitre d' led Richard to the private dining room, a separate space with its own entrance and thick curtains that could be drawn for privacy. "Will this be suitable, Mr. Chen?" "It's perfect," Richard said, but his mind was already working on something else. An idea had started forming the moment he'd seen Riley. It was risky, probably cruel in some ways, but he needed to know something important before signing any deals tonight. He asked the maitre d' a specific question. "That waitress, Riley, who's serving the main dining room, can she serve our private room tonight?" The maitre d' looked surprised. "Well, typically our most senior server handles the private rooms, but if you prefer..." "I do prefer," Richard said firmly. "And one more thing. I need you to trust me on something tonight. Whatever happens in this room, no matter what you hear, don't intervene unless I specifically call for you. Can you do that?" The maitre d' looked confused but nodded. "Of course, Mr. Chen. Whatever you need." 20 minutes later, Richard's 3 guests arrived within moments of each other. First came Theodore Banks, Old money from New York who'd never worked a real job in his life but somehow thought he knew everything about business. Then Patricia Goodwin, a hedge fund manager who was brilliant with numbers but had ice water running through her veins. Finally, James Rodriguez, a venture capitalist who'd made his fortune by being ruthless in negotiations and could spot weakness like a shark smells blood in the water. They all greeted Richard with firm handshakes and practiced smiles, the kind of greetings that happen when everyone in the room has something to gain or lose. They settled into their seats, ordered drinks, and started talking about markets and opportunities and all the usual things wealthy people discuss when they're about to become even wealthier. Then Riley walked in with their waters and menus, and Richard felt his heart tighten a little. She looked nervous, probably because she'd been told she was serving a table of millionaires and billionaires in the private room. Her hands shook slightly as she set down the glasses, but she managed a professional smile. "Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Riley, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you off with any appetizers, or would you like a few minutes to look over the menu?" Her voice was steady despite the nerves. Richard noticed how the other three barely looked at her, already deep in their conversation about market trends. To them, she was just part of the furniture, someone to bring food and then disappear. But Richard looked at her carefully. He saw the way she'd positioned herself to hear everyone at the table, the professional posture despite obvious exhaustion, the genuine warmth in her eyes even when faced with people who probably wouldn't notice if she vanished entirely. "We'll need a few minutes," Richard said, and Riley nodded and left quietly. Theodore immediately launched into his pitch. "Richard, I've been looking at the numbers on your healthcare proposal, and I think if we structure it right, we could see returns of 30 to 40% within the first 18 months. Patricia jumped in. "I agree, but we need to be strategic about the rollout. Cut costs wherever possible initially, maximize the profit margins." James nodded eagerly. "Exactly. And if we keep labor costs down, we can reinvest more into expansion." They kept talking, three wealthy people planning how to make more money, and none of them had any idea that Richard was about to test them in a way they'd never forget. He glanced at his watch. Riley would be back any minute to take their orders, and that's when Richard's plan would begin. A plan that would expose the truth about everyone in this room, including himself. A plan that would change at least one person's life forever, though not in any way anyone could predict. He took a sip of water and waited, his heart beating a little faster than usual. What he was about to do was possibly wrong, definitely manipulative, but absolutely necessary, because Richard Chen hadn't gotten where he was by trusting people at their word. He'd gotten there by testing them when they thought no one was watching. Riley pushed through the door with her notepad ready, that professional smile still in place despite her obvious exhaustion, and the test was about to begin. Riley returned to the private dining room carrying a tray with their appetizers and a bottle of expensive red wine that Theodore had ordered. The bottle alone cost $300, which was more than Riley made in an entire week of work. She'd been a waitress for 5 years now, working her way through community college, and she'd learned to keep her face neutral no matter what people ordered or how they treated her. She carefully set down each plate, making sure everything was positioned perfectly. The appetizers looked like tiny works of art. Truffle risotto, seared scallops, some kind of fancy cheese plate that probably had a French name she couldn't pronounce. These men would eat more in one meal than she spent on food in a month, but Riley had long ago stopped letting that bother her. Everyone had their own story, their own struggles, even rich people. Or at least that's what she told herself to get through the shifts. "Your appetizers, gentlemen," she said with that practiced smile. "And Mr. Banks, your wine." "Would you like me to pour?" Theodore waved his hand dismissively without even looking at her. Yes, go ahead." Riley began pouring the wine into each glass with steady hands. She'd done this thousands of times before. The key was to pour slowly, avoid any drips, and never fill the glass more than halfway for red wine. She'd learned all these little rules at her first waitressing job when she was 19, and they'd become second nature. She was pouring Richard's glass when everything went horribly wrong. 1 second she was carefully tilting the bottle, and the next second Richard's hand shot out, so suddenly that Riley jumped back in surprise. His hand hit the wine glass hard, sending it toppling across the pristine white tablecloth. The red wine spread like blood across the fabric, splashing onto Richard's expensive suit jacket and pants. Riley's heart stopped. The glass rolled off the table and shattered on the floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. "What the hell?" Richard's voice was sharp, angry. He stood up quickly, looking down at his wine-stained suit. "Are you kidding me right now?" I'm so sorry, sir, I don't know." Riley started, her mind racing. She hadn't bumped anything. She was certain of it. But the wine was everywhere, and this man was furious, and her hand started shaking. "You don't know?" Richard's voice got louder. "You just dumped an entire glass of wine on me. Look at this suit. Do you have any idea how much this costs?" Riley felt her face burning. The other men at the table had stopped eating and were staring at her. "Sir, I truly apologize. I was being very careful, I promise. Let me get something to clean." "Careful?" Richard cut her off. "If you were being careful, I wouldn't be standing here covered in wine. I have another meeting after this. What am I supposed to do now?" Theodore jumped in, his voice dripping with disdain. "This is completely unacceptable. Richard, I can't believe the service here. She clearly wasn't paying attention." Riley's throat tightened. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she hadn't done anything wrong. But years of service work had taught her that defending yourself usually just made things worse. "I'm deeply sorry, sir. I'll get the manager immediately and we'll take care of everything." "You'll take care of everything?" Patricia laughed, but it wasn't a kind sound. "How exactly are you going to take care of a $5,000 suit? You probably don't make that in 3 months. The words hit Riley like a physical blow. Her eyes started stinging with tears, but she blinked them back furiously. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of these people. James shook his head, looking at Riley with contempt. "This is why these places need better training. Hire someone who actually knows what they're doing." Riley stood there, frozen, as these 3 wealthy strangers tore into her for something she was almost certain she hadn't done. But what could she say? It was her word against theirs, and she was just a waitress. They were millionaires dining with a billionaire. Who would anyone believe? Richard was still going, his voice filled with indignation. "I want to speak to your manager. And honestly, you should be responsible for the cleaning bill. This is completely your fault." Riley's stomach dropped. The cleaning bill for a suit like that could be hundreds of dollars, maybe more. She had exactly $742 in her bank account right now. She was already behind on her electric bill. Her mom needed help with her medication costs. Her car needed new tires. "And now this, of course, sir," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll get the manager right away. And I'll pay for whatever damages there are." She saw something flicker across Richard's face, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Theodore leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You know what, Richard? This is a perfect example of what we were just talking about. People not taking responsibility seriously. No attention to detail. This is exactly why businesses fail." "Absolutely," Patricia agreed. "In my company, someone like this would be terminated immediately. You can't afford to keep employees who are careless and cost you money." Riley felt like she was shrinking, getting smaller and smaller under their words. She'd been called a lot of things in 5 years of waitressing. Honey, sweetheart, girl, hey you, but careless? That one hurt. She took pride in her work. She showed up on time every single shift, even when she was exhausted. She treated every customer with respect. She'd never in 5 years made a mistake like this, except she hadn't made a mistake. She knew she hadn't. But how could she prove it? "I understand," Riley said quietly, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I take full responsibility. Please let me get the manager." As she turned to leave, she felt something wet on her cheek and realized a tear had escaped despite her best efforts. She wiped it away quickly, hoping none of them had seen. The last thing she needed was for them to think she was trying to get sympathy. She pushed through the door and practically ran to the manager's office. Robert was doing paperwork, his reading glasses perched on his nose. He'd been her manager for 3 years now, and he was one of the good ones. Fair, kind, always willing to listen. "Robert," Riley said, and her voice cracked on his name. "I need you. There's been an incident." Robert looked up immediately, concern crossing his weathered face. "Riley, what happened?" She explained as quickly as she could, the words tumbling out. The wine spill, Richard's anger, the other guests joining in, the demand to pay for the suit. As she talked, Robert's expression grew more and more concerned. "Riley, I've watched you work for 3 years. You're one of the most careful servers I've ever had. Are you absolutely sure?" "I'm sure," Riley said firmly. "Robert, I didn't bump that table. I was pouring carefully." His hand just shot out. But I can't say that to them. They'll never believe me, and even if they did, what difference does it make? I'm still the one who's going to lose my job over this. Robert stood up, putting a hand on her shoulder. Let me handle this. You're not losing your job, and you're certainly not paying for anyone's suit. This is exactly why we have insurance. But Riley knew better. She'd seen this play out before at other restaurants. The customer is always right, especially when the customer is worth more than the entire restaurant building. She'd probably be fired by the end of the night, maybe even have to pay something. Rich people had lawyers. Rich people always won, Robert, she said quietly. Before you go in there, can you do me a favor? When they let me go, can you make sure my last paycheck goes to Mrs. Martinez? You know she's been picking up extra shifts to help with her grandson's medical bills. She needs it more than I do. Robert stared at her. Riley, what are you talking about? Nobody's getting fired. And you're not giving away your paycheck. Please, Riley insisted. I'm serious, Mrs. Martinez has been here for 20 years. She deserves it. I can find another job somewhere. I'm young. I'll figure it out. Before Robert could respond, she continued. And tell her I'm sorry I couldn't help more. Tell her to use my employee discount card too. For whatever she needs from the convenience store next door. The code is 2847. Riley. Robert started, but she was already heading toward the door. We should go. They're waiting. As they walked back toward the private dining room, Riley felt strangely calm. It was like all the panic and fear had burned through her and left behind something clear and still. She was about to lose her job. She'd probably have to drop out of school again, because she wouldn't be able to afford the next semester. She'd have to tell her mom she couldn't help with the medication anymore. She'd have to figure out how to make rent next month, but she'd kept her dignity. She hadn't screamed or cried or made a scene. She'd apologized even though she knew she hadn't done anything wrong. And maybe that was all you could do sometimes. Just try to be a good person even when the world was being cruel. They reached the door to the private dining room. Riley could hear voices inside, still discussing her like she was a problem to be solved rather than a person. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to face whatever came next. Robert pushed open the door and they stepped inside together. The four men looked up and Riley saw Richard's face. For just a split second, she could have sworn she saw something in his eyes. Not anger. Something else. Something that looked almost like guilt, but that didn't make sense. Rich people didn't feel guilty about treating service workers badly. In Riley's experience, they barely remembered you existed 5 minutes after you left the room. Robert began to speak, his voice professional but firm. Gentlemen, I'm Robert, the manager. I understand there's been an incident. I want to assure you that Azure takes full responsibility and will handle any cleaning costs for Mr. Chen's suit. That's not the point, Theodore interrupted. The point is she was careless. She could have hurt someone. What if that had been hot coffee instead of wine? Riley stood there staring at a spot on the wall behind Richard's head, trying to disappear into herself. This was the worst part of service work, having to stand there while people discussed you like you weren't even human. Like you didn't have feelings or bills or problems of your own. Like you were just a machine that brought food and sometimes malfunctioned. And then something happened that Riley didn't expect at all. The room fell completely, utterly silent. Richard was staring at her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Not angry anymore. Something else. Something she couldn't quite read. And in that silence, Riley suddenly realized that something was very, very wrong with this whole situation. But before she could figure out what it was, Richard opened his mouth to speak. And Riley had the strangest feeling that her entire life was about to change. The silence in that private dining room felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Riley stood there next to Robert, her hands clasped in front of her to stop them from shaking, waiting for whatever punishment was coming. She'd already accepted that she was about to lose her job. That was just reality now. All she could do was try to leave with whatever dignity she had left. Richard was still staring at her, and there was something in his expression that Riley couldn't understand. It almost looked like he was studying her, waiting for something. But what? She'd already apologized 100 times. What more could he possibly want? Robert cleared his throat, trying again. Gentlemen, as I said, we take full responsibility. The bill for your dinner tonight will be completely comped, and we'll pay for any cleaning or replacement costs for Mr. Chen's suit. Riley is one of our best employees, and I'm confident this was simply an unfortunate accident. Best employees? Patricia scoffed. Your standards must be incredibly low. Riley felt each word like a small cut, but she kept her face neutral. She'd learned that skill the hard way, over years of dealing with difficult customers. Never let them see they've hurt you. Never give them that power. Theodore leaned forward, his elbows on the wine-stained table. I think the real question is what kind of training program you have here, Robert. Because clearly it's not working. Riley wanted to defend Robert. He'd been nothing but kind to her. He'd let her swap shifts when her mom was sick. He'd never written her up for being 5 minutes late that time her car wouldn't start. He was a good man trying to run a good restaurant, and he didn't deserve to be talked to like this by people who probably had no idea what it took to keep a business running. But she couldn't defend him. Speaking up would only make things worse, so she stood there silently, her jaw clenched so tight it hurt. James was shaking his head. You know what bothers me most? No accountability. She's just standing there like she's the victim in all this. Where's the apology? Where's the ownership? Something inside Riley snapped. Not in an angry way, but in a way that made everything suddenly crystal clear. These people weren't interested in apologies or ownership. She'd already apologized multiple times. They just wanted someone to look down on, someone to make them feel powerful and important, and she was convenient. She thought about her mother, working 3 jobs when Riley was growing up, coming home with feet so swollen she could barely walk. She thought about Mrs. Martinez, who'd been serving tables for 20 years with arthritis in her hands because she couldn't afford to retire. She thought about every person she'd ever known who worked hard and got paid barely enough to survive, while people like these 3 complained about problems that weren't even real, and something shifted inside her. Riley took a small step forward. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but steady. You're right, sir. I should take ownership. The 3 investors looked satisfied, like they'd finally gotten through to her. But Riley wasn't done. I take full ownership of my experience working here tonight. I was serving your table carefully and professionally, the same way I've served hundreds of tables over the past 5 years. I was pouring wine at a normal, safe speed. I did not bump the table. I did not act carelessly. She could feel Robert stiffen next to her, probably worried she was making things worse. But Riley kept going, her eyes meeting Richard's directly for the first time. That said, I understand that you're upset. Your suit was damaged, and that's frustrating regardless of how it happened. I can't afford to replace a $5,000 suit, you're right about that. I make $9 an hour plus tips, but if you need me to pay for the cleaning, I will. It'll take me a few months, but I'll do it. The room was silent again. Riley's heart was pounding, but she felt strangely calm. She'd told the truth. Not the version they wanted to hear, but the actual truth. And if that cost her this job, then at least she'd left knowing she hadn't let them make her into something she wasn't. A careless person who didn't take her work seriously. Furthermore, Riley continued, her voice gaining strength. When Robert said I'm one of his best employees, he wasn't lowering his standards. I show up on time every shift. I treat every customer with respect, whether they order the cheapest thing on the menu or the most expensive bottle of wine. I've learned the names of our regular customers and what they like to order. I've stayed late when other servers called in sick. I've worked double shifts when we were short-staffed. I take pride in what I do. She paused, then added quietly, even if what I do isn't valued by people like you. Patricia's face turned red. Excuse me? How dare you speak to us that way? I'm not being disrespectful, Riley said calmly. I'm just being honest. You've spent the last 15 minutes telling me I'm careless and incompetent, and that I should be fired. You've made assumptions about my intelligence and my work ethic, based on nothing but the fact that I'm a waitress. You've talked about me like I'm not even standing here listening. Theodore started to interrupt, but Riley held up a hand. Not aggressively, just like a person who had something to say and deserved to be heard. I'm not angry at you, she continued. I'm actually sad for you, because I've watched you for the past hour, and I've seen how you treat people. You didn't say please or thank you when I brought your water. You didn't make eye contact with me. You interrupted each other constantly. And the second something went wrong, even something that might not have been anyone's fault, you immediately looked for someone to blame and punish. Riley's eyes were starting to fill with tears again, but this time she didn't try to hide them. Is that really how you want to live? Always looking for what's wrong instead of what's right? Always assuming the worst about people? She turned to Robert, who was staring at her with a mixture of shock and what might have been pride. Robert, I accept whatever consequences you think are fair. If you need to let me go, I understand. But before I leave, I need to make one request. She pulled her employee badge off her uniform and held it out. When you process my final paycheck, please give it to Mrs. Martinez. She's been trying to help her grandson with his medical bills, and she needs it more than I do. Riley, Robert said softly. You don't have to. Yes, I do, Riley said firmly. Mrs. Martinez has been kind to me since my first day here. When I couldn't afford lunch, she'd share hers. When I was struggling with a difficult table, she'd give me advice. When my mom was sick, she covered my shift even though her arthritis was flaring up. Riley's voice cracked. She's 68 years old, Robert. She shouldn't have to be on her feet 8 hours a day serving people who barely notice she exists. If my paycheck can help her grandson get the treatment he needs, then that's what I want. That's the only thing I want out of this whole terrible night. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't tense or angry. It was the kind of silence that happens when people suddenly realize they need to reconsider everything they thought they knew. Riley wiped her eyes and turned toward the door. I'll clean out my locker. I'm sorry your evening was disrupted, gentlemen. I hope the rest of your dinner is better. She started walking toward the door, her legs feeling like they might give out any second. She'd just thrown away a job she desperately needed. She'd spoken truth to power, and power was probably going to crush her for it. But at least she'd done it with her head held high. Wait. The word stopped Riley in her tracks. It was Richard who'd spoken, his voice cutting through the silence. She turned back slowly. Richard was standing now, and there was something different about his face. The anger was completely gone. In its place was something Riley couldn't quite identify. Regret, respect, something else entirely? Don't go, Richard said quietly, please. I need to tell you something. Riley glanced at Robert, confused. The manager looked just as puzzled as she felt. I need to tell all of you something. Richard continued, his voice getting stronger. He looked around the room, his gaze moving from Riley to Robert to the 3 investors. What you just witnessed, what you've all been part of for the past 20 minutes. It wasn't what it appeared to be. Theodore frowned. What are you talking about? Richard took a deep breath, and Riley saw his hands were actually shaking slightly. Whatever he was about to say, it was clearly difficult for him. That wine didn't spill by accident, Richard said clearly. Riley didn't do anything wrong. I deliberately knocked over that glass. I created this entire situation on purpose. The room exploded into confused voices. Patricia was demanding to know what he meant. Theodore was calling him crazy. James was asking if this was some kind of joke. Robert looked completely bewildered. But Riley just stood there, her mind spinning, trying to process what she'd just heard. He'd done it on purpose. All of this, the humiliation, the fear, the tears, the thought that she was going to lose her job, he'd done it on purpose? She should have felt angry. She probably would feel angry later. But right now, all she felt was confused and exhausted and desperately in need of an explanation. Richard held up his hands, asking for silence. When the room finally quieted down, he spoke directly to Riley. I know you probably hate me right now, he said, and you have every right to. What I did was cruel, but I need to explain why. Riley found her voice. I'd very much like to hear that explanation. And as Richard began to speak, Riley realized that this strange, terrible, impossible night was about to get even stranger, because the expression on Richard's face wasn't that of a cruel person who'd enjoyed causing her pain. It was the expression of someone who'd been looking for something specific. And somehow, impossibly, it seemed like he'd found it in her. But found what? And why? And what did any of this mean for what happened next? Riley was about to find out. And nothing in her 5 years of waitressing, her 26 years of life, or her wildest imagination could have prepared her for what Richard was about to say. Richard looked around the room at all the confused, angry faces staring back at him. He knew what he was about to do would probably destroy his business deal with these 3 investors. He knew some people would think he was crazy or manipulative or just plain wrong. But he also knew with absolute certainty that what he'd just witnessed in Riley's response was worth more than any amount of money these investors could offer. I've been testing people for years, Richard began, his voice steady despite the chaos he'd just created, not just in business but in life. I test investors before I work with them. I test employees before I hire them. I test potential partners, board members, advisors, anyone who wants to be part of what I'm building. Theodore's face was turning red. You test people? What gives you the right? Money gives me that right, Richard said bluntly. Whether that's fair or not, it's the reality. When you're worth what I'm worth, people lie to you constantly. They tell you what they think you want to hear. They perform for you. You never get to see who they really are. He paused, looking at Riley, who was still standing near the door, her face a mixture of confusion and hurt. So I create situations where people can't perform, where they have to react instinctively, show me who they really are when there's no time to calculate the right response. Patricia was shaking her head. This is insane. You deliberately humiliated this poor girl just to, what, prove some kind of point? No, Richard said firmly. I wasn't testing Riley, I was testing the three of you. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Riley looked surprised. Richard turned to face his three would-be business partners. For the past 6 months, we've been negotiating this deal. You've shown me spreadsheets and business plans. You've promised me returns on investment. You've told me about your expertise and your connections and all the ways you can make me even richer than I already am. He walked slowly around the table, his wine-stained suit leaving drops on the floor. But you know what you haven't shown me? Character, integrity, basic human decency. And those things matter to me more than profit margins. James stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is ridiculous. We've wasted months on this deal and you're going to tank it because of some theatrical test? I'm tanking it because all three of you failed, Richard said. Spectacularly, he pointed to Theodore. You immediately assumed Riley was at fault without questioning what you'd seen. You called her careless without any evidence. You suggested this restaurant had low standards because of one incident. Theodore sputtered. But the wine that I deliberately spilled, Richard interrupted. You saw what I wanted you to see. And instead of thinking critically or asking questions or showing any compassion, you jumped straight to judgment and blame. He turned to Patricia. You mocked Riley's income. You laughed at her. You suggested she wasn't worth the space she was taking up in this room. You reduced a hard-working human being to a number on a paycheck. Patricia crossed her arms defensively. I was just being realistic. You were being cruel, Richard said flatly. And cruelty disguised as realism is still just cruelty. Finally, he faced James. And you. You called for her to be fired. You questioned her accountability even after she'd apologized multiple times. You saw someone who was clearly powerless in this situation, and instead of showing mercy, you went for the throat. James's face was hard. In business, you can't afford to be soft. You taught me that yourself, Richard. You're famous for it. I'm not soft, Richard said. But there's a difference between being tough in business negotiations and being cruel to someone who's just trying to do their job. If you can't see that difference, then you're not someone I want anywhere near my money or my companies. He walked back to stand near Riley and Robert, who were both watching him with wide eyes. Here's what I saw tonight when I created this situation. I saw three wealthy, successful people immediately side with power over justice. I saw you join in on attacking someone who couldn't defend herself. I saw you enjoy it. Theodore was on his feet now, too. Now wait just a minute. I'm not done, Richard said, his voice hard as steel.
Do you know what else I saw?
I saw a young woman who's probably making poverty wages maintain her dignity under attack. I saw her apologize for something she didn't do because she knew fighting back would only make things worse. I saw her offer to pay for damages that would take her months to afford. I saw her, even in the middle of losing her job, think about someone else who needed help more than she did. Riley was crying again, but this time the tears were different. Richard could see it in her face. She was starting to understand. That's character, Richard continued, looking directly at Riley now. That's what I've been looking for. Not in you. I already saw it in you when I watched you work earlier. I saw how you treated every customer the same, whether they could afford the expensive stuff or not. I saw you help people without being asked. I saw you being kind when no one was watching and you had nothing to gain from it. He turned back to the three investors. I was looking for that same quality in you, and I didn't find it. Not even a trace, and so this whole thing was what? Patricia demanded. Some kind of moral purity test? Last I checked, Richard, you weren't exactly nominated for sainthood. You've crushed competitors. You've fired people. You've made ruthless business decisions that hurt people. You're right, Richard acknowledged. I have, and I've regretted some of those decisions deeply. Which is exactly why I'm so careful now about who I work with. Because I learned something important. When you partner with people who lack empathy, who see other humans as obstacles or resources rather than people, you end up becoming more like them, or you have to constantly fight against their worst instincts. Either way, you lose. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Cancel the deal, he said to whoever answered. Draft the termination papers for the negotiation with Banks, Goodwin, and Rodriguez. I want it done tonight. And prepare a severance for their time, the standard amount, nothing extra. Theodore was outraged. You can't just, we have contracts. Preliminary agreements, which all include a clause allowing me to terminate negotiations at any time for any reason, Richard said calmly, ending his call. My lawyers were very careful about that. You're welcome to sue me if you'd like. I have excellent attorneys. The three investors stood there, clearly trying to decide whether to keep arguing or just leave. James made the decision for all of them. This is the biggest mistake you'll ever make, Richard. We would have made you millions. I already have millions, Richard said. What I need are partners I can trust. Partners who see people as people. And that's not you. James, Patricia, and Theodore gathered their belongings with quick, angry movements. As they headed for the door, Theodore stopped and looked back at Riley. I hope you're happy, he spat. You just cost this restaurant a very important client. Riley lifted her chin, and Richard saw that same strength he'd witnessed earlier. I didn't cost anyone anything. I just did my job. What you do with that is your choice. After they left, the room felt suddenly very quiet. Robert was the first to speak. Mr. Chen, I don't even know what to say. Did that really just happen? Richard turned to Riley, who was standing very still, like she was afraid that if she moved, this whole bizarre situation might shatter and she'd wake up to find it was all a dream. Riley, Richard said gently, I owe you an enormous apology. What I did to you tonight was wrong. I put you through emotional distress for my own purposes. I made you think you were losing your job. I humiliated you in front of people who were being cruel, and the fact that I had reasons for doing it doesn't make it okay. Riley just stared at him, and Richard couldn't tell if she was about to scream at him or break down or what. He wouldn't have blamed her for either. Why? Riley finally asked, her voice small. Why me? Because I watched you for 15 minutes before I even sat down, Richard said. I watched you treat every single person in this restaurant with kindness. I watched you help an elderly couple without being asked. I watched you make a table of college kids feel welcome even though they probably couldn't afford to tip well. I saw who you were when you thought no one important was watching. He took a step closer, being careful not to invade her space. And then I needed to know if that kindness was real or if it was just customer service. So I created the worst possible situation I could think of. I wanted to see if you'd break, if you'd get angry, if you'd lose that dignity I'd seen in you. That's incredibly manipulative, Riley said, and there was anger in her voice now, which Richard thought was completely fair. It is, he agreed. I won't make excuses for it. But I need to tell you why I do these tests. Why I'm so obsessed with finding people who have real character. Richard pulled out his wallet and carefully extracted an old worn photograph. He handed it to Riley, who looked at it hesitantly before taking it. That's my mother, Richard said. Her name was Linda. She worked 3 jobs to raise me by herself. One of those jobs was as a waitress at a diner. Riley studied the photo, a tired-looking woman in a waitress uniform, smiling despite obvious exhaustion. When I was 15, Richard continued, and his voice roughened with emotion, a wealthy businessman came into her diner. He ordered coffee. My mom brought it to him, but he claimed it was cold. She offered to get him fresh coffee, but he said she'd ruined his morning. He complained to the manager. And then he did something that I'll never forget. Richard paused, the memory still painful after all these years. He told the manager that my mom had been rude to him, that she'd rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath. It was completely untrue, my mom would never. But he was a regular customer who spent a lot of money there. She was just a waitress. They fired her on the spot. Riley's eyes widened. Oh my God. We struggled for months after that, Richard said. Mom couldn't find another job easily because the manager gave her a bad reference. We almost lost our apartment. I remember eating cereal for dinner for weeks because that was all we could afford. And my mom, she never recovered from the shame of it. Being called a liar. Being fired for something she didn't do. He took the photo back carefully, looking at his mother's face. She died when I was 23, right before my company took off. She never got to see me successful, never got to stop working herself into exhaustion. And I promised myself that if I ever had the power to do anything about it, I would never let people like that businessman get away with treating service workers like they're disposable. Riley was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "So you test rich people to see if they're like him?" "Exactly," Richard said. "I test them to see if they have empathy, if they can see past someone's job title to their humanity. And if they can't, I don't work with them. Period. No matter how much money they might make me." Robert cleared his throat. "Mr. Chen, this is all very enlightening, but I need to know, is Riley in any trouble? Because from where I'm standing, she did everything right." "She did more than everything right," Richard said. "She showed extraordinary grace under pressure. She thought about someone else even while she thought she was losing her job. She spoke truth even when it would have been safer to stay silent." He turned to Riley fully. "Which brings me to why I really need to talk to you. Not about this test, but about something else entirely. Something I think you might be perfect for." Richard looked around the room at all the confused, angry faces staring back at him. He knew what he was about to do would probably destroy his business deal with these 3 investors. He knew some people would think he was crazy or manipulative or just plain wrong. But he also knew with absolute certainty that what he'd just witnessed in Riley's response was worth more than any amount of money these investors could offer. "I've been testing people for years," Richard began, his voice steady despite the chaos he'd just created. "Not just in business, but in life. I test investors before I work with them. I test employees before I hire them. I test potential partners, board members, advisors. Anyone who wants to be part of what I'm building." Theodore's face was turning red. "You test people? What gives you the right?" "Money gives me that right," Richard said bluntly. "Whether that's fair or not, it's the reality. When you're worth what I'm worth, people lie to you constantly. They tell you what they think you want to hear. They perform for you. You never get to see who they really are." He paused, looking at Riley, who was still standing near the door, her face a mixture of confusion and hurt. "So I create situations where people can't perform, where they have to react instinctively, show me who they really are when there's no time to calculate the right response." Patricia was shaking her head. "This is insane. You deliberately humiliated this poor girl just to—" "What, prove some kind of point?" "No," Richard said firmly. "I wasn't testing Riley, I was testing the 3 of you. The silence that followed was absolute." Even Riley looked surprised. Richard turned to face his 3 would-be business partners. "For the past 6 months, we've been negotiating this deal. You've shown me spreadsheets and business plans. You've promised me returns on investment. You've told me about your expertise and your connections and all the ways you can make me even richer than I already am." He walked slowly around the table, his wine-stained suit leaving drops on the floor. "But you know what you haven't shown me? Character, integrity, basic human decency. And those things matter to me more than profit margins." James stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is ridiculous. We've wasted months on this deal, and you're going to tank it because of some theatrical test?" "I'm tanking it because all 3 of you failed," Richard said. "Spectacularly," he pointed to Theodore. "You immediately assumed Riley was at fault without questioning what you'd seen. You called her careless without any evidence. You suggested this restaurant had low standards because of one incident." Theodore sputtered. "But the wine that I deliberately spilled," Richard interrupted. "You saw what I wanted you to see. And instead of thinking critically or asking questions or showing any compassion, you jumped straight to judgment and blame." He turned to Patricia. "You mocked Riley's income. You laughed at her. You suggested she wasn't worth the space she was taking up in this room. You reduced a hard-working human being to a number on a paycheck." Patricia crossed her arms defensively. "I was just being realistic." "You were being cruel," Richard said flatly. "And cruelty disguised as realism is still just cruelty." Finally, he faced James. "And you called for her to be fired. You questioned her accountability even after she'd apologized multiple times. You saw someone who was clearly powerless in this situation, and instead of showing mercy, you went for the throat." James's face was hard. "In business, you can't afford to be soft." "You taught me that yourself, Richard. You're famous for it." "I'm not soft," Richard said. "But there's a difference between being tough in business negotiations and being cruel to someone who's just trying to do their job. If you can't see that difference, then you're not someone I want anywhere near my money or my companies." He walked back to stand near Riley and Robert, who were both watching him with wide eyes. "Here's what I saw tonight when I created this situation. I saw 3 wealthy, successful people immediately side with power over justice. I saw you join in on attacking someone who couldn't defend herself. I saw you enjoy it. Theodore was on his feet now, too. Now wait just a minute. I'm not done, Richard said, his voice hard as steel. Do you know what else I saw? I saw a young woman who's probably making poverty wages maintain her dignity under attack. I saw her apologize for something she didn't do, because she knew fighting back would only make things worse. I saw her offer to pay for damages that would take her months to afford. I saw her, even in the middle of losing her job, think about someone else who needed help more than she did. Riley was crying again, but this time the tears were different. Richard could see it in her face. She was starting to understand. That's character, Richard continued, looking directly at Riley now. That's what I've been looking for. Not in you. I already saw it in you when I watched you work earlier. I saw how you treated every customer the same, whether they could afford the expensive stuff or not. I saw you help people without being asked. I saw you being kind when no one was watching and you had nothing to gain from it. He turned back to the 3 investors. I was looking for that same quality in you, and I didn't find it. Not even a trace. So this whole thing was what? Patricia demanded. Some kind of moral purity test? Last I checked, Richard, you weren't exactly nominated for sainthood. You've crushed competitors. You've fired people. You've made ruthless business decisions that hurt people. You're right, Richard acknowledged. I have, and I've regretted some of those decisions deeply, which is exactly why I'm so careful now about who I work with. Because I learned something important. When you partner with people who lack empathy, who see other humans as obstacles or resources rather than people, you end up becoming more like them. Or you have to constantly fight against their worst instincts. Either way, you lose. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Cancel the deal, he said to whoever answered. Draft the termination papers for the negotiation with Banks, Goodwin, and Rodriguez. I want it done tonight. And prepare a severance for their time, the standard amount, nothing extra. Theodore was outraged. You can't just, we have contracts. Preliminary agreements, which all include a clause allowing me to terminate negotiations at any time for any reason, Richard said calmly, ending his call. My lawyers were very careful about that. You're welcome to sue me if you'd like. I have excellent attorneys. The 3 investors stood there, clearly trying to decide whether to keep arguing or just leave. James made the decision for all of them. This is the biggest mistake you'll ever make, Richard. We would have made you millions. I already have millions, Richard said. What I need are partners I can trust. Partners who see people as people. And that's not you.